This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
Hello, welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where I, Lee Bortons, Jennifer Courtney, and Timothy Knotts discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. Today is Wednesday, May 29th, 2024, and we're joined by our lovely guest, Stephanie Meter, who's one of our Classical Conversations multimedia curriculum developers. So, Jennifer, tell us about this month's shows.
Well, we've been hanging out in the Classical Conversations Challenge B curriculum. So we've talked about Tanglewood Tales, and we got to interview Avi, who is the author of Crispin, the Cross of Lead, because we have a lot of older books in our curriculum. We don't get that privilege very often. And so we were really excited to talk to Avi about writing. Don't miss that episode. And then today we're going to discuss a book that our team has worked hard on, especially Stephanie, which is called the American Experience Storybook.
So everyone probably knows by now, but we like to repeat it each week that you can access all of these past episodes that Jennifer referred to, as well as all of 2024 and anything from all of 2023, as well as anything we've done this first half of 2024 in 2 locations. You can go to leebortons.com and there's links, or you can go to the YouTube channel at Lee Bortons. Both of them will lead you to a variety of topics and books that we've discussed, as well as it's the leebortons.com site has links at the calendar for the books that are upcoming for you to purchase if you would like to participate. And so welcome to everybody, and Jennifer and Stephanie, glad to be with you here. I miss Tim. He's on vacation, and
He's writing today.
Oh, he's
Yeah.
writing, WRITING.
Writing curriculum today. Yep.
Right. He
Yeah.
probably needed to have the space. So thanks for joining us, though, you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to be here. So you know what I'm going to ask you, because I always ask you the same thing, but this is one of CCMM's own resources. So why did we create the American Experience Storybook for Challenge B students?
Yeah, so one thing Classical Conversations does really well is in our foundations curriculum, we have the students memorize a timeline and just encourage parents to read with their children as much as possible. And then when you get into those challenge 2, 3, 4 in particular, we really bring current events and the things that are going on in the world close to home to the students as they read through the original source documents and classics of ancient times, as well as British literature, American literature. But one thing, so you get to learn about history and characters through literature, but we needed to have a bit of a bridge. And since we did start as an American company, we're global now, we needed something in this Challenge AV1 years to help bridge between just the facts, the timeline, and all the big ideas of the later Challenge years. And so the American Experience Storybook was a good bridge there, and we're really grateful that you guys wrote this.
Yeah, so I think you guys know that I love to collect little stories about, I love to collect children's history books. So this project is also near and dear to my heart because I love preserving some of the stories from the past for new generations of people. So Stephanie, tell us a little bit about how these stories in this volume were chosen.
Yeah, so this was the first project that I ever worked on with CC. It's not the first project that ever got published that I got to help work on, but this one started really early. So I jumped in the process once the list of characters, I think, had already kind of been established. So I know you all started with a big list of historical figures, and we only have 15 weeks in Challenge B's semester that we're working with, so I had to get the list narrowed down. But I remember hearing that the conversations were about that we did have some constraints on the stories. We wanted them to be about these certain characters. They also needed to be public domain stories so that we could republish them. We wanted them to be first person if possible. If we could find first person accounts from the characters and the historical figures, that would be the best way to learn about them. We also wanted them to be positive and uplifting and showing the virtuous traits of some of these people, and then at or below grade level reading, because Challenge B is not the time to really weigh students down a lot with the difficult reads in this strand. It was more just to get the content. So those are some of the qualifications that went into the stories.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned, Stephanie, this idea of presenting people from a positive light. I think when we study history, we're going to find that we have, as a country, any country will find this. You have positive parts of your history and negative parts of your history. It's impossible to avoid that. And each individual person that you study also has those things. But I think, and you guys can comment on this, the pendulum swing right now is either to focus, I think two things are happening. One is that we focus too much on the negative, and some of the positive of what America has meant is getting lost. And then the other thing is you have to be really careful, or at least I have chosen to be with my own children, that nuances are good, but they maybe aren't appropriate at certain ages. It might be more important when they're little to inspire them. And then you can learn about the nuances later, because yes, we are all sinners. Every character we're going to read about has some flaws, but there's an age appropriateness to getting into those nuances. And generally speaking, I would like to start with my kids by focusing on heroes that they can emulate and positive contributions that their own country has made to the world. So what do you guys think about those ideas?
Well, I think that your description of what can happen is accurate, and it's interesting because that was something that I grew up never having to think about, because we kind of all were on the same page in our country as to who our heroes were, at least in the literary world. And we had kind of a expectation of who we'd be reading books about, and of course we knew some of the bad things they did. But one of the things that I wanted to have in this book, and you guys managed to succeed, was that there's a middle school reading level as well as appropriate story level. And so we've talked a lot about the coming of age stories, but this idea of heroic, or I'm gonna say it wrong, heroism, that you just referred to, inspired me to ask you guys to look into these stories in the way that we did from other books I had read, where it showed children and just really important people in our history, where they had did something that was unusual. And that's what I remembered them by. So things like, I remember Abraham Lincoln and his sister Sarah were left in the woods for 3 months because his mother had died, and their dad had to go find a wife, and someone had to hold down the fort. So they were 12 years old, left for 3 months. Now we hardly want 12-year-olds to babysit anymore. And I remember stories like General MacArthur used to bring his mother, his 80-year-old mother, to war with him, so she would pray and counsel him. Those are stories you can tell about anybody that are interesting. And so through this American experience, you guys were able to find some just really great points on different characters in our past that are they're just appropriate because they're interesting.
How about you, Stephanie? I know you not only have collected this, but you've also taught Challenge B students and led them through it a couple times. What kinds of thoughts are you having?
Yes. Just the idea of taking characters from history who have multiple sides to them and have virtuous qualities and poor qualities and made some good decisions, some bad decisions. I agree with you that the pendulum swing is kind of cynical right now. And I think that's good in some ways. I don't know if cynicism is good, but I think that questioning things and looking carefully is good. But I also just know that it's so important to have characters to emulate as well as things to avoid. And so we tend to focus a lot as a society right now on what not to do. And I think it's just as powerful to have what to do. So looking at the positive decisions that these people made and their situations, times that they made noble choices, I think that can hopefully inspire us a little bit, because for the most part, well, everybody in this book, and for the most part, people in history try to do the best with what they can and what they know at the time. And I think that's what we're doing too. We're all trying to do the best we can with what we have and what we know right now.
Good. Yeah, that's good. So so we've talked about this idea of hero. And I think the whole book is set up to have students answer that question. What makes someone a hero? So what kinds of ways would you guys answer that question? What's heroic like to you?
Before we do that, is it possible to show us the table of contents so we know, or at least Stephanie list off some of the folks that are in it so our listeners know?
Yes, give me a second and I can pull up the whole table of contents.
Because sometimes heroism isn't from doing things. A lot of times, especially for young people, heroism is restraining themselves, knowing that, like Andrew Kern likes to say, I am a king, therefore I can govern myself. And those unseen heroisms are really what makes our character so as we get older, people will want to follow us and pay attention to the things that we say and do. So heroism isn't like a one-time bravery act. I think it's a lifetime of choices.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think so. And as you were talking, I was thinking this book in particular is one that's good for us to look at circumstances, because every character in here, every real life character, is limited by the time and place where they were, and also given opportunities by the time because of their time and place and the way they rise to that occasion.
It's even
Sometimes
like
overcoming their limits and sometimes living within them, depending on what those circumstances dictate.
I can even think of that old story, which I don't even know if people know anymore, but George Washington chopping down the cherry
Mhm.
tree, which is probably all myth. But the fact that we were willing to talk about are people that, what, he chopped down trees he shouldn't have.
Mhm.
Right? We said the negative bad things, but then when he was asked about it, he told the truth.
Yeah.
And that's this kind of little parable that you would want even younger readers to appreciate. So that's the kind of thing I think that exemplifies good stories for children. We've talked a lot about in the coming of age books how there's got to be a conflict or there's not much to help you come of age. And so that's going to be true in real life all the time. So did you got the list?
Yes, I do. I can
I think you're
share.
the co-host now, so you.
Yeah. Okay. Are you seeing table of contents? Yeah. Okay. Yes. So we've got an introduction and then these characters. And this is also so this is the hard copy of the book that we have, but there are 2 digital resources too that are the broader American Experience that have even more characters than these.
So tell us a couple of your favorites, Stephanie, when you were going through here, and why'd you include them?
Well, I can't take credit for including them. That was before me, but I can definitely speak to favorites. Actually, the very first one, Benjamin Franklin, and I don't know if this is just because the conversations that I would have with my Challenge B students, it was like the first of the semester excitement, but we always had a lot of fun with the Benjamin Franklin story, and that's the one that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Because, well, and I don't want to spoil it for us in a few minutes, but there's some very interesting dilemmas in that story. And it's one of those where you agree with the character at one point, and then you and the character learn a lesson sort of together. I like the Fanny Crosby stories as well, because that's when we get to talk about some poetry. She wrote a lot of hymns. And so that's a week that sort of takes a little bit of a different turn in Challenge B, because we will look at her poetry and look at rhyme scheme and talk about meter, and sometimes even play around with writing some poems ourselves in community. So that's a lot of fun. I also love the Clara Barton one. I'll do this last one. The Clara Barton story is so inspiring and fun to me, because you just get the sense that she had such a spirit of resourcefulness and joy, even in the middle of something really, really dark. And there's one part in the story, one of the little anecdotes, that they need to operate on some soldiers, and it's at night, and people tell her that nothing can be done. They don't have enough light to help these soldiers. And she says, "Oh, I have a ton of candles in the wagon." And so she just brought all these candles with her, and they light up the barn or wherever they are, and they can work on the soldiers even at night. So she's a very, very cool character.
How about
I
you,
was,
Jennifer?
I was fascinated by Clara Barton when I was a child, because I just couldn't imagine. And that does seem to be one thing that plays into heroism, is sometimes we just are in awe of people who face really, really, really difficult circumstances. So for me as a child, Clara Barton was one of those, that the Civil War hospital, mobile hospital conditions were pretty bad. And yet she was willing to go in and made such a difference, for a very, very long reach. She made a difference in the idea of nurses in battle. And the other one who always inspires me beyond what I can probably even articulate is Helen Keller, because if you talk about difficult circumstances and you're born blind and deaf, and yet somehow you and of course, it's always the story of Annie Sullivan too, that you have this patient teacher who is committed to not leaving you in the quiet darkness that you're born into. And her story just inspires me. The fact that she wrote stories and gave speeches and began to travel, it was beyond, it almost beggars belief that she was able to even function given her difficult circumstances, and the fact that she went on to do so many things. And I as an adult, actually rather recently, I read her own autobiography, Story of My Life, which was like the next level past this story in American Experience, because I just couldn't get enough of her. So I went on and read the whole autobiography.
That's a good segue into also how do these fit into what I opened up with. So for instance, if you scroll back up to the top for me for a second, Stephanie, um, we of course, Ben Franklin, his essay and how he taught himself to write is in the IEW Essentials program. And then George Washington's farewell speech is in our challenge materials. And so I could go through a lot of these folks and say how either they're actually in their other writings that are actually in the challenge curriculum, or they influenced me to put something else into the curriculum. Things like Robert E. Lee, when the war was over and he had lost so much and the South had lost so much, he was offered by what was beginning to be marketing brands at that time to sell his name and to use it for some goods. And he was like, no, my name's the only thing I own. I'm not selling that to anybody. And I just thought about how that is so contrary to anybody today and what they think of with influence and being famous. So there's just great conversations that come from each of their characters, whether you agree or disagree with the choices they've made.
Yeah, and Washington's farewell address is a really good example of that. His willingness to walk away from power is not a thing we often see in the history of the world, much less in contemporary society. In the history of the world, walking away willingly from power has only happened a handful of times, and that's why it stands out to us that he prevented it from becoming a monarchy again just by that action of saying no.
Yeah. And Dolly Madison saving the China.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just fun stories too. It's during War of 1812, for those who don't know, and Napoleon was coming and his fleet. And so the White House was burnt down. Kind of a nice aside, I have a girlfriend who, so a man saved some of the wood from the original White House that burned down and turned it into violins. And she
wow.
owns one of the violins that was made from the original White House.
That's
So
amazing.
yeah, it's those kind of stories. Like, so who's the hero there? Like the guy that thought to save the wood? Those are the experiences that our children find interesting, though, right?
I
I
know.
find them interesting.
And yes, and I look at her, we have a debate in challenge 2 where they debate whether or not it's worth losing one's life to save art. Well, that's what Dolly Madison did. She rushed into the building and grabbed the portrait of George Washington. And I sometimes wonder if we're honoring her well today. I mean, is her name still on a brand of cupcakes? Is that how most people know her? Dolly Madison cupcakes, or is it more important that she was willing to actually risk her life to save the portrait of our founding father?
Something else I think is good about this series is that in this age of media influencers, everybody knows what everybody looks like. But before the 1950s, if you were famous in the United States, you were famous because of what you said. And these are people from before that time. Even Martin Luther King, who of course we have an image of, the most famous thing we know he said was that discuss about the content of your character over the color of your skin. And I have a dream. It's his words that resonate with us, not his image.
Yeah, it's their words and deeds, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's good. Does anyone have anything else to add about heroism? Because we're going to look at one of the heroes. Are you guys good? Do you want to do your ad?
Yeah. So once again, it's time to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com, as well as the 2024 calendar with links to the CC book site. And I appreciate it. Next week, we're going to, or next month, actually, we'll begin discussing the Challenge 1 resources beginning next week with a tour guide into debate, which I just find it so funny how the Lord works. Right before I got on with you, I was actually tracking through 1AC and the parts of it and the parts of a policy debate because we're looking at using it for an adult activity. And so here it is again. So it all integrates. So thanks for sharing that with us. And next week we're going to talk about more debate. So
Alright.
Jennifer, what's next?
All right, so now we're going to do a close reading. And as Stephanie mentioned, we're going to talk about the very first story in American Experience, which is about Benjamin Franklin. And there are some questions in here about leadership and whether the ends can justify the means. So I think, Lee, if you're going to read this first selection to us, I think in this one, Benjamin is 10 years old.
Yeah, my screen just split on me. Give me a second to find it. There it is. Okay. Well, now I lost it, trying to make it big enough to read it. All right. Ben was a bright boy at his book, and even a brighter one when at play with his comrades. He had some remarkable qualities which always seemed to give him the lead, whether at sport or in more serious matters. I might tell you a number of amusing anecdotes about him. You're acquainted, I suppose, with his famous story of the whistle and how he bought it with a whole pocket of coppers and afterwards repented of his bargain. But Ben had grown a great big boy since those days and had gained wisdom by experience. For it was one of his peculiarities that no incident ever happened to him without teaching him some valuable lesson. Thus, he generally profited more by his more misfortunes than many people do by the most favorable events that could befall them. There's a footnote to this. When he was young, Ben Franklin encountered a boy with a whistle and was so eager to have the whistle for himself that he gave the whistling boy all the coppers in his pocket in exchange for the instrument. For a little while, Ben was happy with this purchase, but then it began to sink in that he traded so much money for something he only wanted in the moment. He could have bought many different, better lasting things with this money. As a grown-up, Ben later wrote to his friend, Madame Brilliant, and told her this story, saying that ever since he's learned to remind himself not to give too much for the whistle whenever he feels compelled to spend a lot on anything.
Well, I think we can all relate to that one. So I'm curious, Stephanie, how did your students react to this section of the story, this paying too much for the whistle?
Yeah, we always talk about that in personal, have you ever done that? Have you ever given something, in the moment? And a lot of times we end up talking about Jacob and Esau too, because Esau really gave too much for the whistle in the moment. He wanted some stew and gave away his whole birthright. So the students usually have fun stories of their own, and that gets brought up as well, the Jacob and Esau story. So I'm trying to think of specific things for myself. I know I've done that before, but yeah,
that's really good, that connection to Jacob and Esau. I love it when those moments of just hearing those echoes from somewhere else cause the story to really resonate.
Yeah.
When my David was this age, challenge B, he really wanted a video game. And he came home one day and he said to me, Mom, will you please buy me that video game before I no longer want it? And it was a turning point for him where, he just had to say it out loud that he realized that sometimes he just wanted things because he wanted them. And I think Ben Franklin learned that here too.
I actually remember being in an adult Bible study where one of the participants shared that she just thought she had to have a swimming pool. And she and her husband spent all this money on it. And she said that it was the first time in her adult life that she remembered something that she wanted so badly and spent so much money for, just kind of turning to dust before her, that by the time it was finished, it no longer mattered to her.
Yeah, we hear all that about, the best day you bought a boat, or the best day you buy a race car or horse, or the day you buy it, or the best days are the day you buy it and the day you sell it.
Yeah. I love it that Ben is only 10 here, and it says that he had grown a great deal since that time. Yeah, he had grown a great boy since those days. Like, he's 10, but he's already had a lot of life experience.
Huh. Do you think they really mean great boy, or because it's a children's story, they use boy when they really might have meant young man?
I think he's still very young in this story. He's still like 10 or 12, I think. So maybe the whistle happened when he was like 6 or 8, and he's really just come a long way since then.
So
It
it's,
makes me think of those times too, when I would go out with my children and they would ask me for something and I would say, you're welcome to buy that with your own money if you would like to have it. And then suddenly they got very choosy. It was fine for them to buy it with my money. And then when I said, you can use your allowance, they didn't want it anymore. So it's part of.
now let me ask you, does this a footnote that was part of the original story or one that you guys researched and put in?
No, that was a researched and put in footnote.
So we have those kind of resources to help us.
It's so
Mhm.
interesting to me that he was still dwelling on in later life, that he would write his correspondent and that it became sort of his own personal idiom. I mean, we have all these idioms that we use to remind us of lessons, but the fact that he, for his whole life, reminded himself not to give too much for the whistle, and that trained him in financial matters is interesting to me. That it was obviously a moment of great import in his life.
I'm curious about this madam that he wrote to. Ben had quite a extension of friends globally. I'm just
Yeah.
curious who she is.
Yeah, I would have to go back and look more at the research. I mean, I think she was French, but we can probably tell that from
The
Yeah.
name.
her name. So
Well, and just think about how this incident formed him as he was an ambassador to France for
Mhm.
us.
hmm
So,
Yeah,
and
he's-
he was going to France to ask for money actually for various things we needed as a new country.
yeah.
It's an interesting preparation for that much larger responsibility, isn't it? And it
Mhm.
seems like the author wants you to know that he was a born leader, right? Because he says at the very beginning, he had remarkable qualities which always seemed to give him the lead, whether at sport or in more serious matters. I don't think I've ever thought of him being an athlete. So that also caught my ear this time, that
Yeah.
he sort of seems to be one of those people in life who just immediately led, no matter what the arena was.
But sport, didn't that mean more back then than now? Just meaning not serious because the contrast
Yeah.
was matter. So
Yeah.
playing anything.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, maybe that's true. Yeah. Hmm. I think we can gather that he's going to do great things from this little anecdote. So, Stephanie, you want to read us our second one?
Sure. Okay, so this one takes place when he's playing with his friends. So they're gonna have an afternoon of mischief together. On the edge of the water, there was a deep bed of clay in which the boys were forced to stand while they caught their fish. Here they dabbled in mud and mire like a flock of ducks. This is very uncomfortable, said Ben Franklin one day to his comrades while they were standing mid-leg deep in the quagmire. So it is, said the other boys. What a pity we have no better place to stand. If it had not been for Ben, nothing more would have been done or said about the matter. But it was not in his nature to be sensible of an inconvenience without using his best efforts to find a remedy. So, as he and his comrades were returning from the waterside, Ben suddenly threw down his string of fish with a very determined air. Boys, cried he, I have thought of a scheme which will be greatly for our benefit and for the public benefit. It was queer enough, to be sure, to hear this little chap, this little rosy-cheeked 10-year-old boy, talking about schemes for the public benefit. Nevertheless, his companions were ready to listen, being assured that Ben's scheme, whatever it was, would be well worth their attention. They remembered how sagaciously he had conducted all their enterprises ever since he had been old enough to wear small clothes. They remembered, too, his wonderful contrivance of sailing across the mill pond, lying flat on his back in the water, and allowing himself to be drawn along by a paper kite. If Ben could do that, he might certainly do anything. What is your scheme, Ben? What is it? Cried they all. It so happened that they had now come to a spot of ground where a new house was to be built. Scattered round about lay a great many large stones which were to be used in the cellar and foundation. Ben mounted upon the highest of these stones so that he might speak with more authority. You know, lads, said he, what a plague it is to be forced to stand in the quagmire yonder, overshoes and stockings if we wear any, in mud and water. See, I am bedaubed to the knees of my small clothes, and you are all in the same pickle. Unless we can find some remedy for this evil, our fishing business must be entirely given up, and surely this would be a terrible misfortune. That it would, said his comrade sorrowfully. Now I propose, continued Master Benjamin, that we build a wharf for the purpose of carrying on our fisheries. You see these stones, the workmen mean to use them for the underpinning of a house, but that would be only for one man's advantage. My plan is to take these same stones and carry them to the edge of the water and build a wharf with them. This will not only enable us to carry on the fishing business with comfort and to better advantage, but it will likewise be a great convenience to boats passing up and down the stream. Thus, instead of one man, 50 or 100 or 1,000 besides ourselves may be benefited by these stones. What say you, lads? Shall we build the wharf?
That's a great story. You can, that's one of those stories that's told in such a way that you can picture it. I almost had an animated version of it going through my head with a little animated Benjamin standing on the stones pontificating.
Yes.
Well,
I'll
I
post here
think when they
here.
say small clothes, they might say that word the same way we would say we're in our shorts. Like it's not our
Mm.
suit or our long pants.
Yeah, there's a footnote on that term. I didn't read the footnotes, but let me find it
That's
if you
interesting.
want. I think if I'm remembering right, it's like clothes that babies would wear almost. So it's like since we were little kids, we've been doing this or something.
Well, you always have pictures of, the boys in their knickers and breeches until they were old enough to be men. And you can imagine why, as a mother who has to do laundry, you don't want them to have long pants. They just get them all muddy all the time.
Yes.
So that's part of what I was seeing when you were talking about that too, Jennifer.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think about his argument here for using these stones, because you could certainly say they're not his.
Yes. Well,
Yes.
typical politician to be, right? It's going to be for the public benefit. He even announces that. Yeah. Who
Mhm.
cares if somebody else paid for it?
What I always ask the students too, how they felt at this part in the story.
Mm.
Because reading it, you're very much on Ben's side at this point. And so we'll talk about, how did this idea strike you? Did it seem like a good idea? Did it seem like the reasons were good? What do you think about it? Is that fair to take something that belongs to one person and use it to serve everybody? So it's very good discussions usually.
Mhm.
And sometimes Robin Hood gets brought into the discussion. That happened one year. So
Yeah.
lots of good connections.
Sure.
I was thinking too to my own childhood where we would often go to construction sites. I lived in a place where a new neighborhood was being built, and we often took materials that seemed like they were left there just for us. This piece of wood would be great for our clubhouse.
Yeah.
I'm sure they don't need it. It looks like they've discarded it, so surely we can take it. And then I would always feel guilty later.
Well, I remember doing that too, and I can't quite frankly remember feeling guilty. So
I think my dad has talked about that as well, because his neighborhood, houses were still being built. They were one of the first houses on that street. And so, yeah, there was years and years of just all kinds of materials available.
Mhm. Well, and it might be, we're picturing something that's not true, right? It might be that they really weren't purchased, that they were building a home by a creek bed because there were rocks and they already were kind of in the public domain. It could be also
We'll
what
keep
happened.
reading.
Yeah, I have to keep reading.
Yeah. No, it
That was
was
going to be
definitely
my next question is, are we going to finish the story in the next excerpt?
yeah.
I
Yes.
do want to comment on this fishing business. Was it really their business? Were the kids catching fish and selling them, which is something I did when I was 12, because that's how I could make money then. Or do they just mean fishing business as in sport? Like it's just, this is what we do. We love fishing. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't think it mentions if they were selling them or not. In my mind, it was just for fun. But I mean, that could have been what they were doing to help their families. I don't
I
know.
wasn't helping my family. I was helping myself when I did it.
Yeah, or maybe themselves. They can save up and buy their own stones.
Good.
Okay, well, I'll read since we need more information in order to be
Mhm.
able to answer whether this was an honorable action. I'll read our last excerpt and see what we can come up with. Does that sound good?
Mhm.
All right. Benjamin, come hither, began Mr. Franklin in his customary solemn and weighty tone. The boy approached and stood before his father's chair, waiting reverently to hear what judgment this good man would pass upon his late offense. He felt now that the right and wrong of the whole matter would be made to appear. Benjamin, said his father, what could induce you to take property which did not belong to you? Why, father, replied Ben, hanging his head at first, but then lifting eyes to Mr. Franklin's face. If it had been merely for my own benefit, I never should have dreamed of it. But I knew that the wharf would be a public convenience. If the owner of the stones should build a house with them, nobody would enjoy any advantage except himself. Now I made use of them in a way that was for the advantage of many persons. I thought it right to aim at doing good for the greatest number. My son, said Mr. Franklin solemnly, so far as it was in your power, you have done a greater harm to the public than to the owner of the stones. How can that be, father? Asked Ben. Because, answered his father, in building your wharf with stolen materials, you have committed a moral wrong. There's no more terrible mistake than to violate what is eternally right for the sake of a seeming expediency. Those who act upon such a principle do the utmost in their power to destroy all that is good in the world. Heaven forbid, said Benjamin. No act, continued Mr. Franklin, can possibly be for the benefit of the public generally, which involves injustice to any individual. It would be easy to prove this by examples, but indeed, can we suppose that our all-wise and just Creator would have so ordered the affairs of the world that a wrong act should be the true method of attaining a right end? It is impious to think so, and I do verily believe, Benjamin, that almost all the public and private misery of mankind arises from a neglect of this great truth, that evil can produce only evil, that good ends must be wrought out by good means. Wow.
Wow, that's right. What did Mr. Franklin do for a living?
I don't remember that either.
Yeah, that's okay if you don't know. It just points out, I mean, all these stories you've had.
Oh, soap and candle makers.
Okay.
His
Yeah,
family.
and that's what makes it a good book, is it makes you want to go find out things that aren't even in the book. What about fishing and stones and who's this man?
Mhm.
So what do your students say at this point then, Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, when we come to community, everybody's finished the whole story, of course, so I have to make them pause before and like, hey, what was your initial impression of Benjamin? Okay, now that we've read the whole thing, together, and we're going to talk about the whole thing. This is where Robin Hood comes up a lot of, well, robbing the rich to give to the poor, like, is that a bad thing? And then it's like, well, Benjamin's father would clearly say that was a bad thing. And his argument is that there's no way that an all-wise and just creator would create an opportunity or create a scenario where the only right thing to do is something wrong. God's not going to order the universe in a way that you need to do something morally wrong in order to get at something morally right later down the road. And so maybe when it looks like that, or you think it looks like that, you don't understand. You need to look deeper. You need to look at your options. Yeah, I mean, we just have a lot of conversations about that. And pretty much everybody agrees with Benjamin's father, but I do think it's interesting because we agree with it quickly in a story, and it's harder to agree with it sometimes in real life, I think.
Yes.
Obviously. So maybe something else to talk to the students about is, okay, so Ben needed the rocks and he had a good idea. They really were a good foundation. What could he have done instead?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, could he maybe have asked? Could he maybe have gone to find some rocks that he had to carry, or go buy a rock himself, or, right? Just there's always other options.
Mm-hmm.
It's reminding, didn't we already record an episode of our book club on Not Yours to Give?
Yeah, that's just like Davy Crockett. Tell us what you were thinking.
Yeah, so in that speech that Davy Crockett, or he's talking to someone, so he's campaigning and he talks to a constituent because he had voted in favor, I believe, of giving public funds to war widows. And this, I think it's a farmer that he's talking to, says, why would you do that? That wasn't your money to give. And it's a very sobering lesson for him as a member of our government, that it never occurred to him to think that he was taking someone else's money and giving it to this widows. The widows sounded like a good end, but it was a bad means to pursue it. And that similarly, that story having a story is what caused him to see his own action.
Hmm.
Did I get it kind
Yeah,
of right?
that's the
It's been a
thing.
while since I read it.
That was close. It was a widow in DC whose home burned down and they knew her. It was, it was a singular person.
Okay.
Right. So that almost makes it, in one way you think worse. And this father would say, no, it doesn't. It doesn't matter if it's for one person or lots of people.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change. If this is what you believe.
Yeah. Well, and probably it would have been different if people had been approached personally and said, hey, will you give money to this widow? I'm not very familiar. I don't know. I haven't read all of the Not Yours to Give, although it's been on a link on my computer for a long time that I do intend to read it. But it might have been different if individuals had been approached and asked to donate to the widow, as opposed to having it be taken from them and then distributed. I think that's the difference that we see a lot of times in society. It would be different. I mean, I think everybody should be choosing to use their money in ways that are helping people. And when they're robbed of the choice is when it gets gross, in my opinion. So, but then it's unfortunate when people aren't choosing to use their funds to help. And then you have to decide, well, whose job is it to make them? Well, nobody but themselves. And then it's a whole thing. But I mean, these conversations are really important, and to start them as early as Challenge B with a story, even if it's, maybe it's fictional, maybe it's not. That's planting a seed that they can be thinking about for a long time.
Yeah, and what you just said actually happens in that it's not yours to give. So after listening to this farmer, Davy Crockett goes back to DC and votes against the bill and says, please let's us donate the money to her personally. And the response is not a single senator or congressman donated anything. And Davy Crockett says they could have, in 1 week, most of those men made what most people make in a year. And yet when it came to their own money, how choosy they were, which is exactly Jennifer's point earlier with your children.
Yeah.
So that's why the immoral part comes in when it's not yours to give.
Right.
So.
And I think happily, I can report that many times over the years that I've been in classical conversations, there have been people in our local communities that have had needs, and the community has rallied to meet those. And the one most recent that I was aware of, a family needed some help with tuition, and the donations were beyond tuition and books, and had more overflow from there because people were very generous. So that's a happy version of it, I guess, using your own means to help.
Well, and that's the right. Donations like that should be local and from people because one, if you continue, let's say you are not of the best motivations, well, they can see that. Versus in the situation you described, people probably were happy to give more than they needed because they're probably thinking whatever that problem was, there's probably phone bills to pay and water bills and things that we're not seeing, and they're having difficulty. So of course we'll give them more. And then they can see the generosity of spirit, and then the person receiving it. Like some people say, well, I'd never take charity. And, the scripture speaks so against that. That's the whole reason we are a body, is so that we can serve one another, but it's always voluntarily. So, good one to pick for me, Stephanie. My favorite topic.
I know. I have to just say, and I know we're running out of time, but my grandmother told me a story growing up, and my grandmother had very hard circumstances, and her mother had 5 kids and was abandoned by her husband, and then fell ill and had to go into the hospital. She had some kind of kidney infection. And so their church rallied around them and took care of them and brought food baskets and things. And one day my grandmother was homesick from school when the food basket arrived, and there was a can of pork and beans in the food basket, and she apparently really loved them and ate the entire can and then hid the can because she felt so bad that she felt she had robbed her own family. And I have to say that little story had a huge impact on me for my whole life in thinking about charity, first of all, and the fact that the church rallied around and fed them, and thinking about, cheating your own family. I never would have, I grew up with no frame of reference for that because I was never hungry. And so her telling me that little story just made a huge impact on me for life, kind of like I would imagine this one would make on all of our students about Ben Franklin. So anyway.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for those conversations that you've had. And Jennifer, I always love hearing about your grandmother's life. So I hope it's getting written down somewhere.
I need to do that. Oh.
Okay, so any last words from anybody? Good.
Oh, one random thing.
Yes.
That if listeners want to do book clubs, there's actually a book club guide for the American Experience Storybook on the bookstore website. So if you want to have more of these conversations, it has some general guidelines on just book clubs generally, and then it has discussion questions by the 5 common topics for the different stories in American Experience. So that's just a little resource.
Thank you, Stephanie. We got to get better at sharing that, what our other resources are for each of these books. So that's a good reminder for next time. And we'll see you then. Bye,
All right,
guys.
thanks, guys. Bye.